سلام على من لا نبي بعده ولا أمة بعده ولا أمة بعد أمته ولا كتاب بعد كتابه ولا شريعة بعد شريعته ولا صحابة بعد صحابته. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم والله غفور رحيم. وقال النبي العربي الهاشمي عليه أفضل الصلوات وأكمل التحيات وأزكى المباركات: الحكمة ضالة المؤمن. صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. I actually skipped a lecture a couple of days ago, so that's my fault. That's not ISRA's fault. So I take the blame for that, which is the interaction of Greek and Islamic thought in the early Islamic world. And I wanted to touch on this because it's important for us to remember that our engagement with modernity or our engagement with the West is not a new sort of form of engagement. Muslims have been interacting and dealing with other civilizations for centuries. When the Muslims conquered Spain, they dealt with the Christian Catholic civilization, right, of the Visigoths. When the Muslims conquered India, they dealt with the Hindu Brahmanic civilization. When the Muslims conquered Afghanistan and Iran, they encountered the Zoroastrian and the Buddhist civilization, right? So this idea that, Muslims, what do Muslims do in the face of new knowledge, new forms of knowledge, new forms of thought, new forms of religion, etc., this is extremely old. In fact, in the 8th, 9th century of Abbasid Baghdad, the Khulafa or the caliphs would hold munadhara. Munadhara is a form of debate, a genre of debate in the classical Muslim tradition, where they would have a Muslim scholar and a Zoroastrian scholar debate each other on basic fundamentals of faith. Who has the right religion? The great theologian from Samarkand, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, he mentions both him and his teacher would engage in debates in Samarkand with Zoroastrians, with atheists, mulhideen, with Aristotelians. And so this nature of debate and dialogue has always been present in the Ummah. And again, I mention and I keep mentioning, right? And one of the main reasons why that we as Muslims felt such a shock with colonialism is because we faced both military might and intellectual might. Whereas with, let's say, when the Mongolians devastated the Muslim world with Genghis Khan, we weren't really afraid of his intellectual thought, right? We were just afraid of his military might, and that's why within 100 years, the Muslims assimilated the Mongols, right? Genghis Khan's grandson converts to Islam on the hands of a Hanafi Mufti, by the way. And that story is a very interesting story of Zahidi. And so I think when we see this interaction of Muslims and Greeks, it's very important. Why? Especially because in the West, starting from the 16th, 17th century, Europe saw itself as an inheritor of the Greek civilization. That's why whole forms of architecture, literature, music, art, painting, they're called neoclassical or Baroque forms of art, right? And this idea that they are the true inheritors of the Greeks, right? And so, which is very interesting, right? Because many people accuse Muslims, oh, why are Muslims so obsessed with the past? Why are Muslims so stuck in the past? They're so romantic. They're always so nostalgic about the past. But what they don't realize is that the West was based their whole civilization on the accomplishments of the Greeks. And they themselves were incredibly nostalgic. They built many of the Western universities are nostalgic forms of Greek architecture. In fact, Washington, D.C. itself is a form of sort of restating Greek art and architecture, right? So as Muslims, again, and I always say this, that every civilization is okay with looking into the past. We should not feel that same guilt, right? Where we feel that we need to separate ourselves from our past, right? Because again, if we don't engage our past, they say look to the future. Well, the future is capitalistic, it's American, it's European, and really the natural consequence of that is that Muslims will be muqallideen, will blindly imitate other forms of civilization that are not their own. And that's why the past, our turath, right? That same past that has given birth to us. That's why I always say that we respect our past, and the Abd Rahman says this, that we respect our past like a mother. In the same way that our mother has given birth to us, our Islamic past has given birth to us. So in the same fashion that we honor and we respect our mother, so too we honor and respect our past in as much as it helps us build, right? Ethically, politically, socially, and intellectually. right? And this is where I think this starts, right? Because the Greek, when the Greek sort of intellectual tradition interacted with Islam, it caused a huge crisis and a huge rupture with Muslims. There is no doubt about this. Books and books were written on this interaction. And so just a brief background and a brief history, and then we're going to go into some of Imam Ghazali's sort of refutation, because he is really the first one to mount a defense and to mount a restating of what is different, what is similar, and what is unique, and because that is truly what is necessary today for us as Muslims, because as Muslims we cannot hide ourselves from the moment. We as Muslims must understand the moment that we're living in, but at the same time also reckon with our values as Muslims, as people who are inheritors of the wahi, of the revelation of the Holy Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And again, this is how we as Muslims are going to gain respect in this world. We as Muslims are not going to gain respect as blind followers and people who just simply replicate other civilizational values. As we mentioned in the second lecture, when Muslims conquered all of these various lands, there were two major civilizations in the world. Really, it was the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire didn't have as much intellectual backbone and thought in as much as the Byzantine Empire, because they had sort of inherited all of this Greek thought, namely, obviously, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. And when Muslims conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, these lands were primarily Greek-speaking lands. Now, when Muslims set up shop in these lands, the natural result of Muslims being conquerors was that they now became exposed to Greek thought, right? And we're gonna dive into this a little bit later. But for a lot of Muslim theologians, what they were trying to understand, and this is the same question that plagues us today, that do we as Muslims simply ignore what everyone else is doing, what other civilizations are doing? Or can we as Muslims, using our tradition, using the values, using of the Quran and the Arabic language, mount a systematic critique of other ideologies and other sort of forms that are not native to Islam and that are in fact very harmful to Islam? So what happened was in the 8th century, the Abbasid Khalifa, Ma'mun and Harun al-Rashid, they created something called Baytul Hikmah, which was a translating house. And what they did was, many of this Greek knowledge was translated into Syriac, which was the language of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. And they had Christian Arab translators. One's name was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, he was a Christian Arab, and he translated many of these works into Arabic. Now, I mentioned this because of the fact that here, this is really where it all started, where you had someone who was not really familiar with the rhythms and of the Quran and the Sunnah, and he translated books into Arabic without really acknowledging the receiving language. You see this sometimes when you read certain Muslim texts in English, very, very poor translations. The words make sense. There are certain words in English that nobody else uses but Muslims, right? Like ablution. Have you guys ever heard the word ablution except in a masjid? Or circumambulation, right? These are sort of words that people no longer use anymore. And without really understanding that in a receiving language, there are certain words that carry certain meanings, right? And that we as Muslims, when we don't translate books into English properly, we're not going to be taken seriously. Right? And that's what happened. Non-Muslims did not read those books because those were not sort of sophisticated translations. And what also happened was that many Muslims who were not sort of grounded in their own tradition became fixated on these ideas, on these Greek Aristotelian ideas. And so much so that many Muslims actually left Islam. Especially in these key areas, because again, Muslims at that moment had not yet sort of mounted a serious defense, right? And I think that this is very, very important to remember. I think even just mentioning this translation movement, that first of all, that as Muslims, we are not opposed to any forms of knowledge, but what we are opposed to is forms of knowledge that contradict our values, right? And from the beginning, I think it's very fair to say that Muslims took this hadith very seriously of when the Holy Prophet said, Al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min, that wisdom is the lost treasure of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he's more entitled to it. And this is incredibly interesting, because what people began to ask is that if the Quran is this supreme book of wisdom, it's the final revelation, then why were ideas of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates not mentioned in the Quran? This is what some people asked. In the same way that people today ask that how come theories of physics are not mentioned in the Quran. right? They say that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything, then how come Allah doesn't mention physics in the Quran? And this misses the whole point of revelation, right? The whole purpose of the Quran is what? Right? It's a book of values, it's a book of wahi, it's a book of revelation. Thank you so much. That, I really like the term of meta-ethics, right? It's this broader form of ethics by which that when you put the Quran, when you juxtapose the Quran with any religious tradition or any system of values, it can parse out what is haqq and what is batil, what is true and what is false. That's why one of the names of the Quran is Al-Furqan. Al-Furqan, يعني الذي يفرق بين الحق والباطل. That which distinguishes between truth and falsehood. Right? And when we see this, whether it happened in Iraq, in Baghdad, or whether it even happened in India, right? And I'm gonna go on this tangent very quickly. That when the Muslims conquered India, many civilizations conquered India, but with Muslims it was namely the Afghans and the Turks. The Afghans and Turks would sort of cycle through between conquering various parts of India, but for 400 years the Muslims did not engage the Hindus intellectually. The Brahmins were like, we're a 5,000-year-old civilization. We don't need to engage Muslims because they're a new religion. We don't need to engage them. And they said that they'll come, they'll conquer, they'll leave. And for example, Mahmud Ghaznavi would come, he would raid, and then he would return back to Afghanistan, rahimahullah. And the Tughlaq dynasty, etc. All of these various dynasties. But when the Mughals came in the 16th century, what the Mughal kings really asked this question of that if we as Muslims are going to live in this land and rule this land, how do we make sure that we make Islam intelligible to a 5,000-year-old civilization like the Hindu Brahmins? And this was incredibly important, right? Because if you want to spread Islam, if you want to do tabligh of Islam, if you want to really do da'wah, you have to make Islam legible. This is incredibly important. You have to make Islam legible to the other population, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and this is Mufti Amin, our teacher at Qasim's really brilliant explanation of this, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ لِيُبَيِّنَ لَهُمْ. That Allah does not send any prophet except in the expression and the zuban, in the language and the idiom of his people. Alayhi salatu wasalam. That imagine, and Allah in fact addresses this in the Quran, that why did Allah reveal the Quran in Farsi? Allah says, أَعْجَمِيٌّ وَعَرَبِيٌّ. That would we reveal a Persian Quran and an Arab prophet? Right, because so that the initial qawm, the initial mukhatab people would actually understand what the Prophet is saying. Right, so that as Muslims we need to make sure that are we doing our role to really explain, right, and justify and sort of fortify Islam within the expression, the idiom and the language of our own qawm. That itself is one of the biggest sunnahs of the Prophet. Alayhi salatu wassalam. Is that how do you make Islam legible and without compromising anything? We don't need to compromise on any of the foundations or the fundamentals of Islam. Right? When you read the great Mughal king Muhammad Jalaluddin Akbar, he was the first, for my reading of Islamic history, he was the first person who had the two major Hindu texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas, translated and the Ramayana into Farsi. And these are massive volumes. To show the Hindus that what exists in Islam, what exists in tasawwuf, what exists in fiqh, and that act of translation was so tremendous for this dialogue between the Muslim population in India and the Hindu population in India. So much so that millions and millions of Hindus became Muslim. Right? I'm not saying just because of that, but that was a huge impetus for Hindu Brahmins to take Islam seriously. That Islam is not just the religion of the conquerors, the religion of the Ghazis, but they're a vastly intellectual tradition, right? And this is what we miss as Muslims, right? That are we creating that sunnah of the Prophet of making two traditions in dialogue with each other, alayhi salatu wassalam, right? And but this has to be done with confidence and with people who actually understand the tradition, right? And this becomes a problem with, namely, Ibn Sina and Farabi, who are sort of come from, Ibn Sina is born in what is present-day Uzbekistan. Farabi is sort of from the same broader Persia. And they take Aristotle very seriously. They feel that what Aristotle has to say in Socrates and Plato is extremely intellectual, they're extremely lofty ideas, and that Muslims should take them very seriously. So much so that they begin to say that what Ibn Sina said, or what Aristotle said, is just as important as what the Prophet said, alayhi salatu wassalam. Right? Obviously we don't agree with that, and this is what Imam Ghazali finds very, very troubling. Right? And this is sort of the barakah of the ummah. Imam Ghazali himself, truly, what a significant figure, the great Shaykh Abul Hasan al-Shadili, radiallahu anh, he was from Morocco, he passed away in Egypt. One day he fell asleep in Masjid al-Aqsa. And while he's asleep, he has this dream of the Prophet. And those who have been to Palestine, you have the Dome of the Rock here, and you have Masjid al-Aqsa here, and you have a sahan, or a courtyard in between. And he has a dream of the Prophet on a takht. وَهُوَ جَالِسٌ عَلَى التَّخْتِ, the Prophet sitting on a throne, and Sayyidina Ibrahim, Sayyidina Musa, Sayyidina Nuh, and Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam sitting around them. Now there is a weak hadith where the Holy Prophet had said, عُلَمَاءُ أُمَّتِي كَأَنْبِيَاءِ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل, that the ulama of my ummah, the scholars of my ummah are like the prophets of Bani Israel. So Abul Hasan al-Shadili mentions in this dream that he asked the Holy Prophet, or rather that Sayyidina Musa asked the Prophet that, O Prophet of Allah, you have said that your scholars are like the prophets of my nation. Can you show me an example of this? So Abul Hasan al-Shadili says that bring Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, bring Ghazali. And the Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam asked him, Ma ismuka, masmuka, what's your name? So Imam Ghazali says his whole nasab. He says Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid. I was born in Tus, Iran. And Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam says that, I only asked you for your name. I didn't ask you for your whole nasab. And then Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam turns to the Prophet and asks, can I respond on his behalf? And again, this is a dream. We don't have to take it as a hujjah, but this is one of the great alims have said and has written. The Prophet gives him permission to respond. And he says that, O Musa, when Allah asked you what's in your hand, وَمَا تِلْكَ بِيَمِينِكَ يَا Musa, Allah only asked you what's in your right hand. And then what's the verse in Surah Taha? وَمَا تِلْكَ بِيَمِينِكَ يَا مُوسَى قَالَ هِيَ عَصَايَ أَتَوَكَّأُ عَلَيْهَا وَأَهُشُّ بِهَا عَلَى غَنَمِي وَلِيَ فِيهَا مَآرِبُ أُخْرَى. That Allah only asked you for what's in your right hand. He didn't, and then Musa ﷺ said that it's my staff. I use it to recline on it. I use it to sweep leaves, and I have other purposes for it. Allah didn't ask you what you do with the staff. He just asked you what's in your right hand. Right? And then from that, Musa ﷺ says that now I understand what you mean by this. But this is sort of to show the reception and the maqam and the status and the station of Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, radiallahu anhu, in this climate where people are, there are some elite sort of Persian and Arab Muslims who are leaving Islam. They become mulhideen. There's also the batiniyah. These are people who believe that the sharia no longer applied, that fasting, Sawm, Hajj. They were also called the hashashin, or the assassins, because they would take hashish, or the certain type of opium, and they would try to have spiritual experiences. Mashallah, people do that in LA, and before it was called hashashin, and now we just call it Coachella, right? So this is sort of that continuation of that. And Imam Ghazali wrote a tract criticizing both, right? And Imam al-Ghazali radiallahu anhu, qaddasallahu, they call him Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam. And what he did, which was so phenomenal, is that he went through all of these texts, right? And remember, these are poor translations. He went through Aristotle, Plato, math, physics, architecture, music, political theory. And he went through all of these sciences, and he asked this question, that is Islam offering something unique? That what do I get by following the Prophet? And what does someone get by following Aristotle? And this is an important question, because many people today, in the sort of love of the American dream, right? They say, the Pakistani author Mohsen Hamid, is it Mohsen Hamid or someone else? They wrote a book called The Reluctant Fundamentalist. In America, obviously there's the idea of the American dream. You move to America, you make money, you create a nice life for your family. But in a Pakistani classroom, a Pakistani teacher asked, what is the Pakistani dream? And the kids were like, move to America and live the American dream. Right? And this is the reality, right? That nobody wants to live in their countries. Nobody feels like their religion or their tradition has anything to offer. But Imam al-Ghazali asked this question 1,000 years ago. That what does Islam offer? What does the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet ﷺ offer? And is it offering something much more valuable than what the Greek, Hellenistic, Aristotelian civilization offers? And this is so important, because we need to ask this question today. And there's nothing wrong with asking this question of what does Islam offer that is something different, right? Because when Allah says in the Quran, وَمَن يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَن يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ, whoever follows a religion other than Islam, it will never, فَلَن يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ, it will never, nahi qabul kiya jayega, hargiz nahi, it will never be accepted from him, right? So what is unique about Islam, and what can Islam offer the world, right? And I would encourage everyone to read a treatise, you can find it in English, called Deliverance from Error by Ghazali. And this is
It's an autobiographical reflection of Imam Ghazali asking these questions. What is knowledge? How do I know if anything is true? Right? And a Christian says his religion is true. A Jewish person says his religion is true. The Coachella user says that their religion is true. So what is Islam offering? What is the Prophet offering? And what is the Quran offering? And why are Muslims so intoxicated by the thought of Aristotle, of Plato, of Socrates? And how can Muslims critique that and defend their own tradition in a space of creative and free dialogue, right? And these are some of the questions that he was sort of posing, right? And that sort of sweeping, that tanqih, what we say in Arabic, or sort of just parsing through, is so phenomenal and is what we need today as Muslims. That we need to look at the society that we're living in. We need to look at the culture that we're living in, and see what is beneficial, what is nafi' and what is dar, what is harmful and what is beneficial. And Imam Ghazali said that there are people who say that we shouldn't read anything of the Greeks. He says that, how can you say that? How can you say that just because someone is a non-Muslim, he has nothing to offer you? He says, he said that there are of course beneficial things in there, but that doesn't mean that everything there is true. And because this is what people had begun to believe, that the Greeks had been given a special kind of knowledge that nobody else has been given. There's this incredible debate between a Muslim theologian and a Christian theologian in 8th century Iraq. One's name is Sirajuddin Sirafi and one's name is Matta ibn Yunus. And the debate was that, why is Greek logic, should people study Greek logic and should people study Greek philosophy? And what exists in that tradition that doesn't exist in Islam? And it's a phenomenal debate. We don't have the time to sort of parse through. Just a couple of final points. The sort of Greek assault on Islam was so devastating and so paramount that many people believed, and you can see this in the writings of ulama, that would Islam be able to defend itself, right? And because people like the Hashashin, people like the Batiniya, people like the Mu'tazila, right? We don't speak enough about what the Mu'tazila tried to mount against Islam, where they denied the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Where they said that the Quran was created. A lot of this, again, came from Greek thought, right? And this is what Taha Abdul Rahman says, that we as Muslims should never blindly follow another civilization just to critique Islamic ideas. And this is what we see so often today, that people will mindlessly read a book written in English without even thinking about the merits and the drawbacks of that argument, and they'll say that, okay, well, why doesn't Islam say this? They will do this, right? Without even seeing that maybe this person made an error. Someone came up to me, Imran, you remember this? Came up to me and said that, well, we were just talking about nazar or ayn, or the evil eye, and he said that, one scholar said that the evil eye doesn't exist. He's not really a scholar, I'm not going to say his name. And I was like, did wahi come to him? Did revelation come to him? And so he just blindly accepted what this person had said, and then tried to critique a deeply Quranic and a deeply prophetic idea, and the notion of what the evil eye is. And we should have a lecture just on what that is and what the connotations of that are. But we need to make sure as Muslims that we study our own tradition, we study our own faith, and that as Muslims we have the right to critique, we have the right to engage in dialogue, and that we make dua for people like Imam Ghazali, who went further than, I would say, most human beings. Especially him, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Arabi, and Shah Wali. These 5 people, perhaps more than anyone else in the Islamic civilization, had more brilliance, and synthesized more sciences than you and I can even count on our fingers, and showed us why Islam is unique, why Islam is singular, and why at a meta level, at a wahi, at a revelation-based level, we don't need other civilizations to sort of form our own civilization. And again, this is not to say that we shouldn't read them. This is not to say that there aren't ideas that we can't benefit from them. But we shouldn't then think that Islam is not necessary. No, right? Because what we see today in America, what we see today in Europe, the suffering, the unbridled capitalism, all of that emerges, again, from Neoplatonic, Hellenistic, and Greek thought. And we don't want that for human beings. Right, the limitless amount of suffering, the lack of mental well-being, a lot of this emerges, right? And we're going to talk about the idea of the aql versus wahi, aql and naql, and all of that. But again, I hope this was helpful just as a brief historical and an intellectual sort of engagement, you know, I didn't want to go through some of Imam Ghazali's critiques of sort of Greek ideas, but you know, it's a school night, and I think you guys have to go to school tomorrow morning. But I think just a line from Iqbal that sort of moves me when I look at this past. You know, he says, سرود رفت باز آید که نه آید نسیمی از حجاز آید که نه آید سر آمد روزگار این فقیری دیگر دنای راز آید که نه آید. That will the old song of Islam ever come back again? Will the breeze from the Prophet's city ever flow to the Muslims where they have the intellectual sort of vigor and strength? Sar Ahmad Rozgari in Faqiri, the time for the Sufi has come to go. Digar danai raz ayat kina ayat. Will another keeper of secrets come? And this idea that Imam Ghazali, Imam Razi, these were keepers of secrets, and we make dua. You know, Iqbal also has this other line where he says, you know, falsafa rahat talqina Ghazali narahi. That philosophy has remained, but where are the discourses of Imam Ghazali? And it's a whole separate conversation, but jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa sanadina wa rasulina wa habibina Muhammad bi rahmatika ya